Okay, so we're going to do a few watercolor techniques. The first watercolor technique is called dry wash. It's called a dry wash because you're working on dry paper. So I put down a few different colors of watercolor on my palette, and I just added a little bit of water, clean water to it, and all I'm going to do is I'm just going to apply the paint directly to the paper. This is actually a really nice technique to use. You're working with a small area. I wouldn't do it for an area that's too large because you begin to see some of the brush strokes that are there, and that's not something that you're really going to want to see in your watercolor piece. The next one is a wet wash. So a wet wash, same thing. I have my colors. I'm just going to use a different color. You can use any color you want. And all I'm going to do is get my paint ready. Next thing I do before I get started is notice that I have these little divisions between my areas. I did that because if I did not, in between, if the water's color pieces touch, it's going to bleed into the next color. So a wet wash is called a wet wash because you're starting with wet paper. This is really nice for a larger area in your painting. It works really terrific for skies, grass areas, and again, other areas that are quite large. And again, that is a wet wash. I'm going to start with the glazing. For the glazing, I'm just going to select a color. You can use either a wet or a dry wash for this one, and I'm just going to apply a color. I'm going to take a few minutes to let that dry, and I'm going to go back to this one because when we work with glazing, we are applying then a second layer of paint. The paint is going to be the wet paint on the dry wash, so it's going to actually begin to mix colors. It's called a way of color building. So we're going to come back to the glazing. Wet on damp. So with the wet on damp, I'm again going to apply a color. I'm going to go with a wet wash or a slightly wet surface with this. So I had a little bit of blue pigment in that, but I do want to make it darker than that. So I'll go back in and I'll just add more pigment to that. So with this wet on damp one, this is tricky. So with this particular one, what you're going to do is you want the surface to dry a little bit so it's just damp and not really too wet. But then you're going to take another color. In this case, I'm going to go in with a little bit of the violet. I need to wait a second or two just to make sure it begins to dry. If the color is going to bleed out into the damp area, if I was to go ahead and put it on too soon, the two colors would really begin to mix a lot and you really wouldn't see much of that. And I really want the veining effect. This works really well if there's, let's say, like a foggy day or something like that. So you can put some on here, some pigment, and I'm just going to paint on a couple of lines. It's still a little bit wet, but you can see how it's beginning to vein out into the blue. Now I could use a finer brush if I want to. If I want it to be a little bit more defined of a line, at that point in time, then I would wait for the paint, the first layer, to dry just a little bit longer. So next I have the gradation. So for the gradation, what I want to do, and this one you could do with a wet or a dry wash, I'm going to start with a dry wash on the surface. So on one end, I'm going to start with a darker value, in this case the blue. I'm going to add more water to my brush to lighten the color. And I'll pull it down. I'm going to clean my brush out a little bit more just to pull that color down so it gets lighter in value. And then on the opposite end, I'm just going to go with a different color. I guess I'll go with the violet. Start with a darker value here. And I'm going to do the same but in reverse. I'm going to get a little bit lighter by adding more water to it. And you can begin to see this really looks like kind of like the idea of a value scale. In this case, it goes from one color to light and then into the other color. This would work really well for skies, if you're looking out into a water area and it gets lighter as it goes further away toward the horizon line. I have two different masking ones I'm going to show you. I just applied a little bit of rubber cement to that space. So with the rubber cement, this is something you really don't want to put on quickly, and you obviously don't want to sniff it. It has a really horrible smell, but it works super well. They have a product called Liquid Frisket, which works also very well, but it's kind of a pricey product. So honestly, the same kind of thing, this works so nicely and it's a lot less expensive. Okay, soft masking. Once your rubber cement is dry, and please do wait until it's dry, you're going to apply some of the pigment. You pick the color. I just went and pick yellow because it's hard to see. So for this one, you can see there's a resist here. And what happens with that, it's a nice resist. Ultimately, when this dries, you can just either use a rubber cement eraser, which is a piece of rubber, or you can just use your finger and rub it off. Right now it's wet, so I'm going to just leave it alone. This works really well if, let's say, you're working on a field of flowers or something along that line where you need little bits and pieces masked out. You can maintain the white of the paper. You could lay down a wash first, and then you could go back on top of that if need be. Okay, so with this one, this is now the hard mask. And all I'm doing, I put down some pieces of masking tape. And of course, the paint is going to resist going where the masking tape is. So I'm going to let that paint dry all the way, and then I'll be able to pull the masking tape off. And I'll show you that in a couple minutes. So I'm still now I have to go back to the glazing. It's getting dry, and I'm going to give it just a couple more minutes. So before I get to these splatter ones, I'm going to move down to the salt technique. So for the salt technique, you can use regular table salt, or if you want to, you could use something that's a bit more coarse. Now I'm just going to put a smidgen in my hand, like a little pinch. You don't need much. So you don't want to douse this thing with salt, you just want to add a little bit. So I want this area to be really nice and wet. So I know I hit a little bit of pigment, but I was going to use purple anyway. Don't work with too light of a color. You're really not going to see what it does. I'm going to go with a blue violet here. Okay, so now that I have this on here, I want it really wet, like a puddle on paper. So when I have it like so, put my brush down, I'm going to take a little bit of the salt and sprinkle it on. See how the pigment is then attracted because of the water to the salt. We're going to let that rest on there until it is completely dry. Then we can just rub it off. Speaking of rubbing, the next one is the rubbing alcohol. This is right from the grocery store. So I'm just going to take the lid off for a minute so I can dip my brush in there. I could put it in a smaller container if I want to. So for the rubbing alcohol, same thing. I want this one pretty wet. So I only put a few colors on my palette. I'm going back to this Rose Madder color. All right, so I want this again pretty wet in on my paper, like so. I clean my brush out completely. I'm going to dry it also with a paper towel. Now I can just dip it in, my brush, into the rubbing alcohol. I can either touch the paper or I can tap it, like so. See how it resists again, but it leaves a really cool kind of thing. Now, for both the salt and the rubbing alcohol, this could be really nice if you have something like water, ice, some sort of a winter scene, rain, so many different kinds of things that you can use for it. So I just wanted to show you that one, or actually those two. I'm going to go back to glazing. So for glazing, that one is pretty dry at this point. So I'm just going to get a color ready. This is like, I call it like a glazed donut. It's kind of like the icing on there. You get the opportunity, you can see how you can color build. Now if I wanted to show like warmth hitting something, like the sun hitting like a brick building or whatever, I could apply a little bit of a warm color, in this case like a yellowy ochre type of color, and it gives that warmth. I could also do the reverse, and in an area where there's some shadow, I could then apply a cool type of color. Now, it does change the color, but I did want you to see how it's a light value for both the yellow and in this case the ultramarine blue. What it does is it allows you to color build. Okay, so I didn't bring plastic wrap over here for the time being, so I'm just going to move to what I have here in front of me, one of which is going to be the sponge. So for the sponge, you could even use like a regular sponge from the sink. This one is a little bit more porous, and it allows you to do some fun things. So I could either apply a color, let it dry, and then go back into it, or I can just dampen this color. I already have some colors that are ready to go on my palette. So for the sponge, I can begin to dab it. I can color build. I can use more than one color if I want to, but it gives you a really nice textural effect on there. Okay, it's really light in value, but you get the idea, and you can always go back and get darker if you want to. So the next one I'm going to show you is the dry brush. So for the dry brush, it simply means that you're going to take a brush, and if you have a fan brush, that's great. A lot of people don't. So what I do is I take the tip and I begin to spread the bristles apart so it looks kind of like a fan brush. Before I do that, however, I'm just going to apply and get my paint color ready. Apply it to the paintbrush. So now what I'm going to do is I will spread my bristles apart, and this allows me the opportunity to see some of the various bristles. You could do this with a curved line, you could do it with a straight line. It's really nice for hair, for fur, for different kinds of things, for grass, and you can use whatever size brush that you do want, but the idea here is to allow some of the underlying color or paper, whatever color it is, like if you have the white paper or you applied a wash on there, to show through. So that is another one. Okay, so we only have a couple of these left. I started getting my Sgraffito one ready by applying just a wash to that surface. I needed to dry completely before I move forward with that. So the next one I'm going to show you is this one, the plastic wrap. I grabbed a little bit more pigment for on my palette, and for plastic wrap, I want this one to be quite wet also. I like the word puddly, it just seems to work for it. So while it's rather wet, and you can see it's like a puddle on my paper, I'm going to take just a piece of saran wrap or plastic wrap, just a little section. You can just crumple it up and kind of get the texture that you want out of it. Now with this one, you're going to apply it, and you're going to leave it on your paper. You can start to see where the paint color is moving toward. You're going to just leave that like that so it dries 100%. Okay, and then you'll be good to go. You can pull it off when that is also completely dry. Sgraffito is definitely not ready yet, but I have a couple others I can show you. One of which is the Q-tip for picking up paint and colors. So let's say you have your color right here, and you've decided you want to pick up a little bit of the color. This could work really well for skies. This is just a regular Q-tip, and I can begin to pull up some of the color, just a smidgen. It's not going to make it the white of the paper, but it can softly pull up some of the edges, and that can give you a nice area of slight definition if that's what you're looking for like a cloud or something that's soft in there. So it kind of gives you that idea. The other thing that you could use is just a regular tissue. So you can go right ahead, and I'll do another blue. I did these really small just so you can kind of see what it looks like. Now you can use paper towel, whatever works for you, but same kind of thing. You can dab it up, and that way you can kind of get a look that you actually want on your area, but you got like a light pickup and more of a heavy duty kind of pickup. Couple that are left, so we have your splatter painting. Now for your splatter, you can use a brush or you can actually use a toothbrush. So either or will work just fine. So you can go ahead, and I put just a little bit of the pigment on here. Now I can splatter on a dry surface, and you get the idea here. You can splatter one color, several different colors, and it gives you that nice look. It's just really nice for backgrounds if you're adding a little bit of something. It needs a little bit of texture, sand, all that kind of stuff. That can work super well. Now the splatter on the wet surface, same kind of thing. I'm just going to throw a little light color down just because I can. Because the surface is wet, you probably figure out what's going to happen. It's just going to slightly bleed out on here. I could wait till it dries a little bit if I want to, but that makes it a tad bit more subtle, and some people really like how that looks. So that is that one. Now the last one I wanted to show you is this Sgraffito. So I already applied my color to that surface. I forgot to get an X-Acto knife. You can use anything that's pointed, so I just quickly grabbed an X-Acto knife, and with this one I can just begin to slightly scrape away at the surface. Now this would be the last thing you'd want to do on your surface, because once you do that, it scrapes away literally the top of it. So now that I have that, that could work really well for sunsets, or even if you had a little bit of some subtle detail on the tree and something, works out really super well. So there you have it. I'm not ready to pull off. I could probably pull off one of these maskings just so you can kind of see what that looks like. You get that nice harsh edge from the masking tape. From this one, you can just even use your finger and begin to pull up some of that soft masking just so you can kind of get an idea of what that looks like. This I just put on, so it's not ready to go. But I hope you get the idea. I hope you enjoy using some of these techniques with your painting, and we'll be moving forward. Thanks.